Hi.
Good to see you.
It is really nice to see you. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you everyone for taking the time and being here today. Looks like we have a good group here. I am Lauren with Me Too Many Voices, and this is part of the MTMV SAAM celebration and observance. Today we are joined by Kathryn Marsh and Melissa Hoppmeyer. Together they are No Grey Zone RRC, career prosecutors working at the Special Victims Family Violence Unit. I'll pass it off to you two to introduce yourself a little bit more, and then we'll get going.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us here with you today. We are thrilled to participate in Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I got my teal out for today. We are so happy to be here to answer any questions anyone has. As you indicated, we're career prosecutors and special victims, but we also have the No Grey Zone podcast. When the pandemic happened and trials were put on hold for a little bit, Melissa and I talked about what can we actually do to hopefully, in many ways, reduce the number of sexual assault survivors that come in our doors as prosecutors. And we've learned that education really can be prevention, and that we've also learned a lot of times individuals don't know their rights or what resources are available. And so we started the No Grey Zone podcast, one, to talk about early warning signs for families and adults, but also to talk about resources and tips that are available for survivors. So hopefully, one, we can, get the rape myths put aside. We can hopefully reduce rape culture, and we can start making some real differences here.
Yeah, and we're just really excited to be here to answer any questions. We know that it can be really daunting to go through the justice system, whether that's civil, and I know you have an attorney on later this week to talk about that, or later this month, but it's also really daunting to go through a criminal investigation. And so we want to answer any questions that we can for people who are going through the process, thinking about going through the process, and just talk about, what to expect and what you should expect from your prosecutors.
This is fantastic. I know as a survivor who has gone through the criminal system, criminal court system, how I have so many questions, and I know other people do as well, because how are we supposed to get this information? And so thank you for, for caring and for wanting to make sure that victims know their rights and know what to expect. And I remember first time you told me about the podcast and all the work that you were doing with No Grey Zone RCC. I was just so floored, and it gave me hope that there are prosecutors out there who do care, who want to dismantle the rape myths, that are there on the side of the victim. So thank you. I know that we have some folks who have questions, and I know that you have a lot that you want to share with us. Is there a certain place that you'd like to get started?
Whatever works best for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why don't we start with the things that you want us to know?
So I think, one of the first things that we really want you guys to know is that every single state in the U.S., so all 50 states and the District of Columbia, there are victim rights. And you have, everybody talks about the Constitution and the defendant's rights, and certainly the criminal justice system is designed to ensure the rights of the defendants. But over time, thankfully, although, we're not there to a place where I would say that the criminal system is trauma informed, but we're moving there. We've developed over time the rights of the rights of the victims, and you should know those rights before you go in to give a police interview. There are some states that will allow you to have an advocate or an attorney present with you when you give your interview, and you should know that, so that if the detective says you can't have anybody in there, you can tell them, no, I know my rights, and I know that I have the right to have an advocate with me or to have my attorney with me. This is the person that I'm choosing, and to make sure that they're not infringing upon your rights. And so I think that's really one of the most important things that, that Kathryn and I see a lot, is that by the time that things get to us, the ball has already started rolling, and victims don't know what their rights are. They don't know, how they can access. Do they have the right to meet with the prosecutor before the prosecutor makes a determination on whether to file the charges? In every state, the victim has the right to know what plea offers the state makes. They may not have the right to veto it, but they certainly have the right to know, discuss it, put their thoughts on the record. I tell victims all the time, you may not agree with me, and you have the right to tell the court that you don't agree with me. And whether a victim agrees or disagrees with the outcome of a case, I let the court know, because I think it's important to be transparent. The court should know where the victim is. The defendant should know where the victim is. And certainly the state does. We are advocates on behalf of the state, but we're advocates on behalf of victims too.
And everything Melissa said is right. I think what's most important, oftentimes what gets missed in busy schedules, is the very beginning of victims' rights across this country. It says a victim is to be treated with respect and dignity. That's the very basic premise of all victims' rights. And I think we need to make sure that law enforcement is being held to those standards, prosecutors are being held to those standards, and we enforce those standards with the court. Basic respect and dignity. When Melissa and I look at sexual assault cases specifically, we know that a victim and a survivor has already had their choices taken from them. And they absolutely should have a voice, and they should have a say in the process. And as Melissa said, sometimes where we come down on a recommended sentence may be different, where we come down on what we think an appropriate plea may be different. But a simple thing is, every time I meet with my victims, even before I finalize charges, I let them know I'm going to push this as hard as you want me to, or I'm going to try to resolve it if that's what you need. In many ways with sexual assault cases, we need to look at them almost from that physician standard of do no harm. And, the initial horrific act has already happened. And as special victims prosecutors, we need to make sure we are reducing trauma as much as possible.
It's nice to hear you say that. And I saw someone asked in the comments as well. So where, everyone lives in different states. Where do people find out about what rights are available for, because they do vary state to state. And then a second part of that question, what if they are violated?
So I'll take the first part, Melissa, if you want to hit the second part.
Sure.
So
Perfect.
every state has to publish the victim's rights. And so you should be able to Google anywhere in the state you are. So Pennsylvania victims' rights, and all the victims' rights for criminal victims should pop up. Every prosecutor's office should have a link to the victims' rights on their website, but every state must publish them. They are there. They are accessible. I will recommend also that for jurisdictions that have family justice centers, which are best practices, and if you don't have a family justice center in your area, please feel free to shoot us an email or DM us on social media, and we'll help connect you with other resources or what you should do to bring a family justice center to your jurisdiction. Family justice centers also are a great resource to victims' rights and in making sure that victims' rights are followed.
And with regards to your rights are violated, most states, and you can do this by Google too, have victim rights resource centers that will provide pro bono attorneys to victims, not only to make sure that their rights are not violated, but to make sure that if they are violated, that the proper remedies, so there are civil remedies that are in place in order to make sure that your rights are not being violated, and that if they are, that you can make sure that those people are held accountable. For instance, in the state we practice in Maryland, we have a resource center, and if a victim is not allowed to, at a bond hearing, is not allowed to, talk and tell the court what their position is in regards to bond, the attorneys that represent the victims can file an appeal of that bond review to the higher court to ask the court to say, hey, this judge didn't listen to the victim. They didn't consider what the victim wanted. You need to send it back, and that judge needs to reconsider the bond, considering what the victim wants. And that's just one of the things that the victim, the victim advocate or the victim's attorney does. And, we work hand in hand with our victim advocates in Maryland so that they know when bond hearings are coming or sentencing are coming, and they can file the motions that are appropriate because they actually represent the victim where we represent the state. And so we want to make sure that we're working together, as Kathryn said, to do no, and so that everybody has their role and is doing so to make sure that the victim's voice is heard.
Thanks for explaining that. I know I have one question, and then I see some other people have some follow-up questions as well. But what if the resource center doesn't do anything and they say that they don't want to, that there's no recourse that they can take and basically just leave you on red, so to speak?
So outside of the victims resource centers, there are other victims programs that can help. For example, some areas have sexual assault legal institutes that provide attorneys free of cost or at reduced cost to sexual assault survivors that can actually help walk them through the entire process. Many communities have gender legal resources like a Women's Legal Resource Institute or other gender-based crimes that can provide pro bono or reduced cost attorneys. I think it's important for victims to know that they do have those rights. And even if they don't have a resource center, they can hire an attorney to ensure that their victims' rights are met. It's one of the few places where appeals can actually be lodged after the fact. So for example, the state, if we go to a sentencing and the criminal defendant gets a sentence we don't want, if we were a part of it, we can't appeal. But just like Melissa talked about a bond hearing, if a victim is not heard at sentencing and they have the absolute right for their voice to be heard, they can actually get an appeal. And that court of the next level, they're called different things everywhere, court of appeals, superior courts, whatever they are, can actually order a whole new sentencing hearing to be done so that that victim's voice can be heard and taken into account at sentencing.
And I think that I would just add to that, that you, like Kathryn said, you can hire your own attorney, but if your rights are being violated and the resource center isn't helping, that is really what local representatives are there for. And contacting your local representative in your district saying, hey, these are my rights. This is what happened. I need assistance can really be a helpful tool if you're not getting help from the resource center and your rights are being violated.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Thank you for the amazing questions. I see them coming in fast and furious. I am not sure we're going to be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best to get to as many as we can. And I'm seeing, a lot of people chiming in general with the opposite of trauma-informed care and support. And I'm really sorry that happened. You never deserve to be harmed, and you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. That probably what was one of the hardest times in your life, and I believe you, and I'm sorry that those were your experiences.
And if I can just, I've seen so many of these comments pop up, and it's breaking my heart that they've made a report and they were laughed at, or that they were told, you really just probably changed your mind. And one, that's not acceptable anywhere. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that is not acceptable, and there is recourse. And if a victim survivor goes to make a report and they are not treated with respect or dignity by either law enforcement or the prosecutor, they should contact our victim services and they should follow up on that. We are big supporters of individuals if they have not been treated with respect by law enforcement or by the prosecutor. Go to the supervisor. They need to report higher. They need to make sure that this is being done. Although trauma-informed care is not new, and Melissa's like the expert on the history of trauma-informed care, although it's not new, it's still somewhat new in the criminal law field. And Melissa and I train almost bi-weekly now on trauma-centered investigations and the proper ways to do them. And and we did one today, we've got one later this week, and making sure that investigators understand how trauma-informed investigations need to work and how you respond to a victim. Also, just to point out, a couple of resources that are available is EVAWI, so the End Violence Against Women International Organization. They have an entire campaign called Start with Belief, and what's 10-year anniversary, I think?
Yeah, I think 10 years. Yeah.
And so they really work on bringing campaigns to law enforcement in different jurisdictions. And so if you're finding that that's an issue in your jurisdiction,
Oh, we lost
Volley, and contact them saying, I have a problem with my investigators not starting with belief here in my community. How can you help me? One of the comments too was with regard to the university and college, and truly recommend reaching out to It's On Us or End Rape on Campus, because they have a ton of resources available that can help you as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of you saw today that the Biden administration has started the period of time to try to change the Title IX rules. We do trauma-informed investigations not only for criminal investigations, because they're so important, and I can tell you that they create better cases, stronger cases, with better outcomes, but also doing trauma-informed investigations for colleges and universities, because these cases are, they're quasi-criminal proceedings now, and they also need to understand that they need to be trauma-informed, and trauma-informed, what that means is that you're understanding the trauma, but you're also helping to corroborate by looking for other evidence, that you don't want to rely solely on a victim to make or break your case, because they can't always provide you with all that information, because you understand they've experienced probably the most traumatic event in their life, and that memories are not linear, and they're not stored in the same way that we would think of as if you go to the grocery store, right? I may be able to recite the beginning and the end of going to the grocery store, but if I'm sexually assaulted, or I'm in an abusive relationship, I can't probably tell you what the first thing that happened is and the last thing that happened is. I only may remember one or two things, but what trauma-informed investigations do is say, okay, take those one or two things and match them up with other evidence, text messages, photographs, whatever it is, surveillance video. We have a lot of things we talk about. But those are the things that are not being done, and that we, encourage law enforcement to do, and that we're encouraging universities to do. And those are things that you guys as survivors should not have to encourage law enforcement to do. That's their job.
What a breath of fresh air. This should be the norm. But, thank you for that. I remember when we were talking, at one point you mentioned that people who maybe don't have a lot of memories, or again, it's all jumbled because of the trauma of it all, the way we do store those traumatic memories in our body in a different area in our brain. I think it was, you asked, what is it that you remember, or what will you never, remind me of that? I think what I'm getting at.
What will you never forget? Because you get such, and we say powerful, and we understand that it's traumatizing, but for we have to present evidence that a jury has to consider, and in the criminal justice system, we have the highest standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. But those specific memories can be so powerful, especially when you can, match them up to a photograph of the thing they can't forget that you found in the defendant's room. And so, that's one of the questions we teach the investigators to ask is, tell us the one thing that you'll never forget. And the responses that they get, they'll tell us afterwards, like, wow, I don't know why I never thought to ask those questions in the 15 years I've been an investigator. Those have helped my cases.
That kind of leads into to a question that someone chimed in ahead of time. I want to know more about the he said, she said cases, when there's the perpetrator and the victim, no witnesses. What can be done about this, if anything? Which I can imagine that's the majority of cases, right?
It's a lot of them. And one of the things Melissa and I believe in is to be honest, right? We're not going to ever sell anybody a bill of goods. It can be hard sometimes, and sometimes we may not get enough evidence to meet the criminal standard. because for us to charge, we have to know that we can at least ethically, in our opinion, meet that beyond a reasonable doubt standard. Now, a lot of cases get categorized as he said, she said, and there's a lot of evidence that people don't consider, right? And so a he said, she said also involves who's the first person that the survivor told what happened? And what was the demeanor like of the survivor when they told that first person that it happened? How about, can we show on their phones, right, through GPS data, were they in the same place at the same time? All of a sudden, is it just a he said, she said, or is it a he said, she said, and there's GPS data that backs up what she said? And we have a witness who said, you know, the survivor called me, you know, when they got home, and they were hysterical. And now all of a sudden we have a witness who can talk about the demeanor of the survivor. Or maybe they went and they had to see a therapist because of the trauma, and they have a diagnosis of anxiety or PTSD. And so it's not he said, she said. It's finding all of these other little pieces of evidence that corroborate what our victim says. And that's our job on the law enforcement side, to ask those questions, to get those details, to take us beyond a he said, she said.
Thank you for that. And while we answered it as he said, she said, I also just want to remind everyone that is listening that sexual violence does affect all genders, and that all genders can be perpetrators, and that all genders can be victims.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, she said, she says, he said,
yes.
You know, got them all.
Every combination.
Yes. Another question we had that came in is, what are some things or evidence that has a lot of sway, whether charges are filed or not?
You know, I think, like Kathryn said, every jurisdiction and case is different, but you know, what we look for is things that are going to corroborate the survivor's statement. And that can be, you know, as little as a text message. For example, I've had cases before where, you know, the survivor says, I was so intoxicated I couldn't consent. And I had text messages where you couldn't understand what the survivor's texting, right? They're like jumbles of words. I don't have an alcohol test to say how intoxicated she is, but any reasonable person can look at that and say, you know, someone who's typing these things is clearly not in a place to be able to make any sort of decision, certainly not decision about whether or not they want to engage in sexual contact. That's something that's helpful. You know, I've had cases where, you know, it's a consent defense, and you have surveillance video of the victim, you know, the survivor really, really happy and happy-go-lucky going into a building and then coming out, and it's clear that the person is sobbing. That, to me, is corroborative evidence of not a consensual encounter. You know, people don't cry after they have consensual, you know, aren't sobbing uncontrollably after they've had consensual sex. You know, it doesn't have to be, you know, it is very rare that you get, you know, a case where you have someone who's witnessed a sexual assault. It just doesn't happen very often because it's typically two people who are involved in it. And you know, perpetrators are very smart, and they don't take people to a place that's public or conduct this behavior in a place that's public. They purposely remove, you know, victims from a location and take them somewhere where they're not going to be detected. And so we don't often have someone who's interrupting a sexual assault as a witness. But there's so much evidence that I think we miss, whether it's just little pieces of things. Kathryn talks about the first person that they talk to, text messages, you know, surveillance video. That is just, it's not going to be the act, but it's going to be things that, you know, corroborate what the survivor says happened. And that is powerful evidence.
I'm wondering, you know, often I hear stories, and I know where someone won't even be given an investigation, where they're almost like laughed out of the police station, or there may be a quote unquote, you know, a bad fact that the prosecutors are holding on to. And it seems like, it's going to be too hard to prove anyway, so they don't do an investigation, or they decide not to move forward because they don't think they'll be able to win the case. Can you speak to any of that? And then I do see some questions involving minors that I want to make sure that we get to as well.
Sure. So one, you can't decide, you can't prove a case until an investigation is done. And I think if somebody makes up their mind at the very beginning and the investigation isn't done, it's time to get a different investigator. With regard to prosecutors, it's a hard job. And I will tell you, one of the things that we have in our unit is we review all cases as a unit together before we make a decision that we can't charge, because we want to make sure we have every mind possible, looking at it from different angles. Is there anything outside of the box that we can think of before we make that ultimate decision that we can't charge? If a survivor is told we cannot be charged, they are due the honesty of why we can't charge. We will meet with victims. We'll talk with them on the phone. Even during the pandemic, we made arrangements to bring a victim in socially distanced way. We got permission to open up the court to bring them in so we could explain to them one-on-one why a charging decision had to be made the way it is. What I can tell you, though, we also do a lot of times is where I told you honesty is the most important part, and respect and dignity. Oftentimes we'll meet with a victim and we'll say, look, this is 50-50. You need to know right now, this case is 50-50 going in. But if you want us to proceed, we will proceed. Because where we said, victims have already had choices taken away from them, and it's important for them to get a choice back on those difficult on the edge calls where we could charge or not charge, meaning there's enough evidence that we could meet our ethical burden, but we are worried about how it is at trial. It's important for the victim to make that call.
And I think it's important to add, and I know Kathryn has said this, is that you have to start from a place of believing the victim. And so even in the cases where we can't charge, it's not that we think the victim is lying. It's just that the evidence, we don't have enough evidence to be able to meet our burden of proof. And I think, for survivors who have already experienced so much, just understanding that people believe them can be everything. I mean, I've had cases that I've won and cases that I lost, that the most important thing to the survivor was not the win or the loss. It was that somebody believed them and someone was willing to fight for them. And I think that that's really what is important. And I don't think you should get into this work unless that's really what you want to do, is you want to support survivors because you believe them, because you know that this has happened to them, that it's happened to other women and men, and that you want to, really try to make a difference in their lives, regardless of the outcome of the case.
Truthfully, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. I'll admit that to all of you here. I think I gave you 2 heads up. I'm in the midst of a criminal lack of investigation. I was told that my case was different and that it was an exception because the perpetrator was in the public eye, and that they had to handle things differently, and that I have not, that they believed me and they wanted to help me get my day in court, but that months later I would be told that I'm not even going to get an investigation. And I keep trying to push it forward, and it feels like I'm just screaming into this empty abyss where it's just this cycle of zero accountability, except I'm the one being asked to be accountable with no return, with nobody taking it seriously, and being told, that they don't need to look at the facts of the case, that they don't need to do an investigation, that they don't. And so it's hard and it's frustrating. And I am so grateful for people like you who do get it and who clearly are good at your jobs and center the survivors. And I know for me and, for so many other victims, going through the system was just yet another betrayal, yet another trauma. And then people are like, why didn't you report? And it's like, well, reporting doesn't always guarantee that something's going to happen. And I wish that people understood that.
Yeah.
But thank you all for letting me share that. Sometimes it's hard and it's frustrating.
We appreciate and respect your courage so much, and that what you have done with your trauma is to work to give voice to so many others and to put light on this, because the only way we are going to change the outcomes that we have with sexual assault cases right now is to make it a community conversation. The only way we change sexual assault outcomes is to change the minds of potential jurors. That's how we change 50-50 cases, right, to 80-20, is by making sure this is something we talk about in the community all the time, that we make sure people understand, you know, the myths about false reporting are just that, myths, that sexual assault has the exact same percentage of false reports as any other crime of violence. But we don't sit here and say, hey, the person who had their house broken into, did they really have a TV, or what were they wearing when their house was broken into? It's an automatic start with belief. And with Me Too, Many Voices, you're making sure we can work truly on getting that start with belief and that culture of changing our jurors, because that's really what we need to do.
Thank you. Me and so many were on a mission, and, you know, thank you for being part of it. I won't hijack this entire Instagram live, but I will just say one other thing that is, and I've been very open about it, is I am someone who, my trauma response is the fawn response, the appease, and I ended up having sexual contact with the man who raped me after. And I know that has always made my case complicated, but I know for me, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to come forward, is because I do think more of these cases need to be tried, and more of these types of cases need to be brought out in the open, because otherwise, you know, it's already so taboo to talk about. But once people realize how common that actually is as a trauma response, that maybe there can be some change with swaying those jurors as well.
Absolutely. I think, you know, Kathryn and I talk about the myth that sexual assault is the scary person in the bush that jumps out. And certainly that happens, and those cases are just as traumatizing as any other. But the vast majority of the cases that we see don't involve somebody you know, someone you were in a relationship with. And you know, and sometimes, like you said, people you continue to be in a relationship with, or started one because you wanted to protect yourself. And unfortunately, those are not the cases that have been predominantly tried. And so our jurors see that as like an anomaly when it's not. And so, you know, part of what we do, not only we want to educate our jurors, but are to try these cases as long as the victim is on board, because we're not going to change the perceptions that defense attorneys have, or that judges have, or that jurors have, if we're not showing them that this is what sexual assault looks like, that this is the face of sexual assault, and make them, you know, and hold perpetrators accountable. And yes, sending them to jail or having them register as sex offenders is an important part of accountability, but so is a trial. So is the ability for a victim to get on the stand and under oath look at their rapist in the face and say, you did this to me, and I'm telling everybody in this courtroom that you did this to me. And, you know, that is a form of healing for so many people, but it's a form of accountability, because if people aren't held accountable, if they don't have to sit in that defendant's chair, what makes it that they're not going to do it again? You know, my hope is that even in cases where I don't get that conviction, that perpetrator thinks twice about the next time they want to sexually assault somebody, because they know that in the jurisdiction where we prosecute, they will be tried. And the second time, I might get them.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. want us, there's so many good questions. This is such a great conversation. There's never going to be enough time, and this is why these conversations are so important. You know, there's so many people here with questions because they don't have any other place to get them answered. So thank you again. Let's see, back to kind of what you were just saying. Someone said, I want my rapist and the people close to him to hold the weight in knowing he did this to me. Absolutely. Let's see. There was a couple of questions about minors. I am trying to scroll back to how are cases with victims who are minors dealt with? Is it really appropriate to allow parents to press charges without consent to their underage child?
So it depends. I'm sure, as you guys know, with the law, so many things, you hear that all the time. It depends. So as prosecutors, we have two jobs. One is to seek justice, and the other is obviously to protect the community as well. And so sometimes when we're looking at minors, what might be extremely difficult for the minor to have to go through, we have to be looking at on the protecting the community aspect as well. So for example, a case that we had, let's say it was a volleyball coach who was engaging in numerous sexual relationships with underage minors. And it is clearly a crime, and it is clearly exploitation. And we may have a minor who's like, I can't go forward, or because they're master manipulators, believes they're in a loving relationship with that coach. And our job is still to speak up for that victim, even if they don't understand the ramifications of the actions at that point in time. If it's sexual abuse of a minor by somebody who is a family member or a household manner, we're going to go forward because we need to stand up for that victim when no one else is. We do get other cases, for example, where it may be, you know, sometimes they call it, although we hate the term, the Romeo Juliet, where it's consensual sex between minors, but because of statutory laws with regard to a jurisdiction, and those are treated a little different, right? Those aren't going to be the same thing as somebody who's exploiting a position of trust or authority and taking advantage of a victim. When we're looking at a 15-year-old who may be having a relationship with a 20, 21-year-old, at that point, we need to meet with the victim. We need to make sure that they haven't been groomed, they haven't been manipulated, because oftentimes that's a background factor that the victim themselves doesn't understand. But we will meet with the victim in those kinds of cases. So like I said, it does depend because the nature of the relationship, how the relationship began, all of those are factors that we have got to consider first.
This question came in when someone just met them and said yes to going somewhere with them, but then they did it in reference to a minor.
I mean, so again, every state has different laws in terms of age of consent. And so what you can have different types of sexual assault, right? You can have one that is age-based, based on the victim's inability to consent based on their age. You know, a lot of states are between 16 and 18. And so if you're under the age of consent, you can't consent. But then there are also force, right? And it doesn't matter whether or not you're above or below the age of consent when force or coercion is used. In some cases, coercion, most cases it's force or a weapon, or, you know, making the victim incapacitated in multiple ways, whether it's self-incapacitation or forced incapacitation. Those are different types of crimes. And so no matter whether they're a minor, there may be additional statutes that apply. But if force or, you know, a person is picked up and then, you know, under false pretenses and brought somewhere else and then sexually assaulted, whether they're a minor or not, it may affect the sentencing guidelines or how much time a person gets if they're convicted of the crime, but it's still going to be a sexual assault. And we try, you know, to speak to our victims and make sure that we're considering what they want, and every prosecutor should. But as Kathryn said, a lot of these perpetrators who engage in sex with minors are master manipulators and have made victims believe that they're in a loving and healthy relationship when they're really being exploited. And we need to make sure that we're protecting not only that victim, but future victims, because a person who exploits minors just like a person who's sexually assaulted isn't one and done. They're going to continue in that pattern of exploitation. And just as in any sexual assault, it may not be traumatizing in that moment when they think they're in love, but it will certainly have an effect on them later down the line.
Thank you for that. Someone asked, what if the prosecution team doesn't collect evidence?
So and I know some of this is terms of art. So the prosecution team shouldn't be the ones collecting the evidence, but they should be working with the investigators to collect the evidence. What we require is that we are notified by law enforcement when a sexual assault occurs, and we screen the case with the officers, and we direct follow-up investigation to collect evidence that we know we'll need for trial. Oftentimes we'll have victims, as we indicated, we start our conversation with our victims early during the course of the investigation so that we can meet with them, let them know the process, what to expect, and factors like that. Oftentimes a victim's going to report something to us that they've never reported to law enforcement for a variety of reasons. Maybe because we're female and the detective was male. Maybe because we've talked to them in a different way so they feel more comfortable letting us know details. Or maybe they thought, hey, the investigator is judging me or is laughing at me, but I can tell, the prosecutor this. So we're going to do that, but then we're going to direct law enforcement to go back and collect that evidence or do a follow-up statement, because we can't make ourselves witnesses to the case. We need to make sure that we have law enforcement or other witnesses who can testify. If it's not being done, one of these things is, and it sounds crazy where we say follow up with victims' rights, but do follow up with victims' rights. Follow up with supervisors. It's Melissa and I get emails all the time or phone calls, and sometimes it's a miscommunication. Sometimes, hey, a phone number, a digit was put in wrong in the system. And so the attorney been trying to call the victim, but was calling a wrong number. And we're able to, if somebody calls us and follows up and says, hey, this attorney's not getting back to me, or I don't think they were listening to me, we can help intervene. And, we never once get upset, and our attorneys don't get, upset or defensive if we say, hey, we think something got missed here. Let's make sure we get it right, because our job is to try to get it right.
I wish we could clone you. So that in itself is a whole different area. That's the subject of a different live. The ethics of cloning in the legal system. We are getting close to the end of time, but someone did ask, and they put this in a couple of times, what do you do if they get out on bail while, hold on, let me read that again. What do you do if they get out on bail while in jail before trial?
Okay, so I'm going to start, Melissa, you finish this up. Unfortunately, and let me be clear, the pandemic has kind of changed our lives with regard to bail and bond, because we have people who are on bail and bond for charges that we would never have seen on bail and bond before. In part because of a pandemic, and if you have an outbreak in a jail, there's additional factors that have to be considered. And courts must balance justice, so they must look at risks to both sides. Also, depending on where you are in the country and the state of the pandemic in your area, we had trials on hold for about a year. And so judges were allowing people out on GPS bracelets because of how the pandemic was going through our area. So there's different factors like that. Obviously, what a judge has to consider in most places are two things. They have to consider public safety. Is the public at risk because of this person and the allegations of this offense? So we can tell you, we believe sexual assaults. We're always arguing that there's a public safety factor. Statistically, 80% of people know the person who committed the sexual assault against them. So it's not that stranger jumping out, but it's still a public safety component. And then courts also have to consider, is there a risk for the person not showing up for court? And so bond isn't considering guilt. It's considering those factors to ensure public safety and to ensure the person will show up in court. And so we'll make arguments. Victims, again, they have the right to address the court to weigh in on those factors. And then the court has to balance them. And oftentimes we'll disagree with the court, but that's our job, because like I said, the judge has to do the balancing part. One thing I will say is that if somebody is given a bond condition or they're put on a GPS bracelet or anything like that, is the factor that there are going to be conditions that are set. No contact with the victims. Often if it's a minor, no contact with any minors, different things like that. And it's really important, if there's any violations, that survivors let prosecutors know right away so that we can file to withdraw their bond, to put them back in jail, because clearly they're not abiding by court orders.
And I think that the only thing that I would add to what Kathryn said is that, another important tool, it's not a criminal tool, but it's an important tool when you're having criminal cases, is if you qualify for a protective order, a restraining order, whatever they're called in your temporary protective order, whatever they're called in your jurisdiction, that you're working with your victim attorney to get those things. Because there are many states, one that, that if they violate the terms of the protective order or restraining order, that those are additional criminal charges. And also they're an added layer of protection, because there are many states that allow for lifetime protective orders if the person is ultimately convicted of the crime for which the restraining order, protective order started. And those are just, I always say it is a piece of paper, and a person is not going to abide by conditions of bail or commit some heinous crime that they may not agree with it. They may not abide by this piece of paper. But for a lot of people, they don't want to violate protective orders, and they will stay away. It's a way to document any additional harassment, or a way to document the pattern of behavior if it's an ongoing abuse. And it's just a really important tool. And something that's, the courts can assist with if the person is let out. You obviously want to make sure that you're safe, and you should be contacting your prosecutor's offices, and they can connect you to services if you need help with relocation or, with changing your phone number. There are so many services in every jurisdiction. Kathryn talked about family justice centers, but there are organizations that help with all of those things, that help you, relocate, will help you change your phone number, will help you, do all different types of things to make sure that you're safe while the defendant is out.
And if I can there's been a couple comments I just want to address real quick. So Melissa and I are not military prosecutors, so I want to say that. But when individuals have indicated, I've seen in some of the comments that they weren't charged, it's years later, things like that. I think it's really important for people to understand statute of limitations. They're different all over. For example, our jurisdiction, there's no statute of limitations for any felonies. I know in federal government, there isn't a statute of limitations on sexual assault in other states. So even if you had reported a case years before and nothing was done, and you've learned there's additional evidence, if you want to go forward, report back. We've gone forward in just the last couple of years in cases that were originally reported in the 90s. And either because of our mentality with regard to sexual assault at that time, or we've found different evidence now than we had, we've gone back and we've charged. So if the case wasn't investigated correctly the first time, go back, you can make a report. Want to also highlight that the Biden administration did put forth a work group right now on sexual assault reporting in the military. They've got 90 days. They've just started it. And they indicated that they're going to be taking information from military survivors. And so you need to watch that. They're going to have a setup for that. So make sure you report on their website how you reported, what the outcome from the military was, and what you'd like to see happen now, because they're doing this work group to try to make sure they get it right. And so I just encourage anybody who is in the military to follow that, and they are calling for information from survivors, and that's how we're going to get that improved. And then Melissa, I don't know if you want to mention JADO real quick, because we know oftentimes victims like to come forward together.
Yes, and I did see I just saw a post about whether or not you have to report your crime to the police, and typically in most jurisdictions you report your crime to the police. But JADO is a really great tool that Kathryn and I found a few months ago. Yeah, we love JADO. And JADO it's a trauma-informed platform, and it allows victims or bystanders who witness sexual conduct or sexual assault to report it. It times it. It allows allows you to keep that information, and then when you're ready, it will allow you to report it either to a civil attorney or to the police. We've worked a little bit with JADO, or trying to work with JADO on a serial rapist case that I have, and they've been really fantastic. It's JADO. We can put it, I don't know how, can you put it in the chat? It's also an app. You can download the app. They're on Instagram too, I think at JADO. And it also will connect survivors if you have the same perpetrator. And I know how important it is for a lot of survivors. They may not be comfortable coming forward originally, but when they learn that there are 2, 3, 4, 5 other victims, that might be enough for them. You know, there are power in numbers. I know that, you know, the whole basis of this Me Too movement is to know that you are not alone. And so JADO, part of their platform is to say, you know, you are not alone, that there are other people who are saying the exact same thing. And there we go. They're on there now.
They're on there.
Because we do love them. That, you know, it's a really powerful platform because it allows you to control your own information and make a decision when you're ready for it. But it also allows you to connect with other survivors and not feel so alone. Which is, I think, you know, a huge part of what the Me Too movement is all about, which is knowing that, you know, we may not share the exact same story of sexual assault or sexual misconduct, but that unfortunately women, predominantly women, but other men, we have all experienced something, and that, you know, we are better together and we are stronger together, and we're going to, you know, help eradicate gender-based violence together.
And then I will say it's called the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military. So if you go to the U.S. Department of Defense, they have a section which is IRC. And so follow it up. They just started the process. And so they've indicated, I don't think the section is up yet for the survivors, but follow it. They're posting updates all the time on where they are with the Independent Review Commission, because this is how we're going to change how military handles reporting and service providers. And the one little thing that I love, just real quick on JADO, is if you know, for example, the social media account of your abuser, or you know you have a picture of them and you have any identifying information like that, JADO automatically goes through their system and they will match people who have been assaulted by the same perpetrator. Like, they can do all of those links, and on stuff that, you know, outside of law enforcement, you know, we've got a database in our jurisdiction that may not connect to another jurisdiction, which may not connect to another one. And JADO can really help unite survivors so that they can be that show of force together.
Thank you. Thank you for providing that information. I cannot believe it, but we are out of time. Regardless of whether we want to be or not, Instagram will shut off our live in a couple of minutes. They said that you have ripped it out where we just have a couple of minutes left before the time limit. So I just want to make sure that I can thank you properly. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work that you do, for the education. Thank you for being here and educating us. Thank you for continuing to have these conversations and train and educate with, you know, people all over. That's how change is going to happen. Thank you. And again, everyone, we are joined today by Kathryn Marsh and Melissa Hoppmeyer from No Grey Zone RRC. And you can find them on Instagram at No Grey Zone RRC.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.
If I didn't answer, feel free to send us DMs, and we're happy to answer any questions we have that we can.
Thank you again. I am so grateful for you. We will have to do a follow-up one because I feel like there are so many questions that we did not get to. So maybe we'll plan that for another time. I do have some resources that I want to be able to share on my screen that will take the full screen for me to be able to. So I will say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you again for being here and joining us on this Tuesday afternoon. I know that this can stir things up. It is important for us, for us to be safe, safety first. I have some resources here. You can always reach out to me at Me Too Many Voices. Here are some additional resources as well. Thank you so much. I'll leave this up for a moment. And stay tuned for other events with Me Too Many Voices for Sexual Assault Awareness Month.